Today is May 26, 2010, and June and Ken Hunter are interviewing Tom Pensack in Voorheesville, New York at 7 o'clock in the evening. He served in the United States Air Force from December 1971 to October 1979. Please tell us your full name and when and where you were born.
Thomas Edwin Pensack, and I was born in Phillipsburg, New Jersey in 1951. And
what did you do before you went into the Air Force?
Well, I graduated from high school in 1970, and at that time electronics was becoming a larger part of society in the early days. So I went to electronics training school. It would be like equivalent to a 2-year school today, like a technical school for electronics, but I wasn't really motivated that much. At that time, we all had draft numbers, and according to the year and month that I was born, and the date of the month I was born, the number I drew was, I think it was like 48 or 49. So with the Vietnam War going on, the lower draft number of people got drafted first. By going to an electronics school or any kind of trade school, you weren't drafted, you were allowed to go to school. So that kept me out of the Army for, say, the first year. But my interest in electronics at that time wasn't as good, although I went for about a year. So when I dropped out of electronics school, then I was up to be drafted, because they were way past my draft number by then. They were up into the hundreds, and I would have gone months before that. So instead of allowing the Army to draft me, I decided to join the Air Force, and that's how that started. And the testing for the Air Force was pretty rigorous. And what I wanted to be when I went to be interviewed by the different recruiters was a weather observer or weatherman. I just always enjoyed the weather. But they didn't need any weathermen at the time. It would take like another year for that to roll around. So I needed to do something earlier, sooner than that. And I had done very well in mechanical and very well in electronics on the Air Force tests because of the electronics training I had in the year leading up to trying to enlist in the Air Force. So with that, they had an opening in Precision Measurement Equipment Laboratory. They called it PMEL, which is a calibration and maintenance of electronic equipment. And they would send you to a fairly long school for that, about 9 months in Colorado. So that's what I signed up for, and then joined the Air Force, actually on an early enlistment. I joined up in October and didn't go in until around December 13th, 1971 is when I actually left to join the Air Force. And went to Lackland Air Force Base, Texas for basic training, which I think lasted around 9 weeks at that time. And I don't remember exactly the whole detail. I think I left from up around Scranton, Pennsylvania. I remember my mother and father drove me north, and I believe it was to either Binghamton or Scranton. And from there we left on a plane and flew to Ohio, I believe, and then flew from there down to Lackland Air Force Base for 9 weeks of basic training, and it was quite interesting. I think that was the very first time I had actually flown in an aircraft, was going off to the Air Force. So that was rather interesting. And the thing I remember about Texas was, of course, you know, you shave your head and everybody had the same uniforms, and it was pretty rigorous, although not as athletically extensive as like the Marines or the Army would be. They were less physical training and more mental training with different things. One of the things I remembered about Texas was it had beautiful sunsets. The land was flat. Of course, I'm an East Coast guy, used to the mountains, and the land there was very flat. I remember we were down there in December and January into February in '72, and the sunsets were just absolutely beautiful. It was dry air in the wintertime there in Texas, a little cool, but just absolutely beautiful sunsets. I'll never forget that. It was really something that really was moving to me. Otherwise, I mean, basic training went pretty well. I don't remember the names of the guys I was with. We were a tight group. We did a lot of things then that I don't think you do now. Like you had to work in a cafeteria. You had to, wash dishes for 2 or 3 days and help with a lot of different cleanup things. I think they have contractors do a lot of that work nowadays in the military. But back in '71, '72, we spent like a week in the chow hall, going there, say at 3 o'clock in the morning, and help wash dishes and set things up for the breakfasts of everyone else who would come in very early in the morning, and then work lunches and work dinners. I think we did that for like a week, was to work in the chow hall. And I remember that because it was a lot of work, but it was very rewarding to see how the whole system functioned in feeding, a couple thousand people out of a chow hall. So that was interesting stuff. We went to, what's the city right there near? I don't remember. We saw the Alamo. Whatever city the Alamo is, and I forget.
San Antonio.
San Antonio. We went to San Antonio on leave for 1 day. We had a 1-day pass. We all went there on a bus, visited the Alamo, and sat around had some went to restaurants and stuff on the river there, and that was quite interesting. But I don't remember a lot of detail. I didn't have a camera or anything at the time, but it was just nice to get off the base for one day, towards the end. After basic training, then I went to a 9-month electronics training school at Lowery Air Force Base in Denver, Colorado. And trying to think, I had never been out west, so Denver was a beautiful city to go to. Of course, once we got on the base, it took maybe 3 or 4 weeks being like a temporary quarters until your class was ready to start. So again, we did a lot of KP duty, cleaned up around the base, you swept, you used to do as a labor force, cleaning things and working in chow halls and stuff until we were ready to start our training as a class. And then went through 9 months of training, and it was pretty rigorous, but it was like 8 or 9 hours a day. There were 3 shifts, and I believe the shift I was on was like the afternoon, like 3 to 11 o'clock at night was the training shift I was on. And they had classes running 24 hours a day, 5 days a week. So when you weren't in training, though, you had a few other duties to do, but you basically had the time off to study, and it was kind of like going to college. Much more lax environment as far as rules and regulations go. You had to be in uniform, but you could walk around and go to the BX and go off base and do things. You had a lot more leeway. A couple guys had cars, so we could drive around a little bit. We'd go in the mountains on the weekends and do things like that.
Did you find it difficult to find time to study?
No, there was plenty of time to study, and they kept right on you as far as your grades in class and things like that were. So you had to really keep up with your duties. We were in a large barracks. We had 2 people, myself and another guy. I'm trying to think of how many. Yes, 2 people in a room. So we had 2 guys to a room. We had like a centralized latrine or shower room and stuff on our hallway. And the barracks held like 1,000 men. It was a very large building. I think they're still there today. They were just fairly new when I started. So there was like 1,000-man dorms, they call them. They had large chow halls, and all the guys there went to different training classes on Lowery Air Force Base. PMEL, the Precision Measuring Equipment Lab school that I went to, was only one of several. There was like bomb navigation and different sites of maintenance. There were large hangars for guys going to different types of training, and at least there were several 1,000-man dormitories, and so it was a training base. There were no more active aircraft there. The runways were there, but they were no longer used. They were all abandoned. But the hangars and stuff that were used, I guess, back during World War II, were all used as training centers. And they would have aircraft and bomb equipment set up, and guys would load and unload and do all sorts of training in those buildings. And we had a large building off to one side, off the old runway area. That was the PMEL Training Center, which is where I went to school. And that lasted 9 months.
Now you said that they had classes going round the clock?
Yes.
So you could have been going to school at midnight until...
Correct,
8?
yeah. Some guys were going midnight to 8, other guys like 8 to 3, 3 to 11. So it was an evening shift, which worked out kind of nice. You had all morning to do different things.
So
it was just 5 days a week.
Your instructors had to be up doing that too.
Exactly, yeah. They had shifts of instructors, and it was very well orchestrated, and it was a big demand at the time because during the 70s and 80s, of course, electronics became much more in use. I mean, they had electronic equipment before that, but computers were just beginning to come out. Back then, in training, we used slide rules. There was no, handheld calculators were just being developed. They cost hundreds of dollars to just add and subtract, multiply and divide. And we used slide rules in training for all our mathematical computations. There was no one who used calculators, although they were just beginning to come out with calculators. At that time. And this would have been like, summer 1972-ish. So it was a while back. The classes ran 3 shifts a day. Instructors were different on each shift. And the people being trained were going out to Air Force bases all around the globe to work in electronic repair facilities, which were becoming larger and larger, did more and more work as equipment became more computerized and electronics became more in demand. And people, once you were done your training, you were trained in basic calibration, electronics techniques, and then, depending upon your specialty, once you went out to do your work at a particular Air Force base, in my case, I went to McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey, is where the lab was that I was assigned to. The laboratory had many different areas, like AC calibration, DC calibration, oscilloscopes, test equipment, TACAN equipment, IFF, which is identification friend or foe. So people who worked on these specialized equipment would go back to Lowery and go to a specialized training school, which was a portion of the building was separated and used for specialized equipment that they would train people on. So as an example, identification friend or foe calibration equipment is used to calibrate and set up the equipment on the aircraft that is beamed out to other aircraft that are identified in the area, and that identification friend or foe tells the pilot whether that aircraft is a friend or a foe. And that equipment that's used to set up the equipment on the aircraft is very, very specialized and very top secret because of the coding that's used, and each day the coding is changed so that no enemy aircraft flying anywhere nearby would be identified as a friend. It would be identified as a foe because it couldn't communicate back to the aircraft being flown. So that type of calibration was very specialized. And there were other things like that that were specialized as well. So in going to McGuire, I was put in like a DC calibration area, which used very, very accurate, sensitive DC measurements for calibrating voltmeters and equipment like that. So they had their standards that they got from the National Bureau of Standards, and you calibrate the devices, and then you use that to calibrate the test equipment that the airmen would use to work on the aircraft. So that's kind of how that worked. Like each piece of equipment had a certain maintenance interval. So every 3 months or 6 months it had to come back to our PML lab. It had to be cleaned and checked out and made sure that it was accurate reading in whatever function it did. So when it went back to the maintenance guys on the airline, on the flight lines, they knew the measurements they were making were accurate, or the things they were calibrating, whether it be frequency or power or anything, was air pressure, was accurate air pressure, or voltage or current or frequency or power, anything like that. All the equipment was calibrated. So that's what they did in the lab I worked in, which is a very interesting in the sense that it was a very clean environment. You had to wear special shoes, you had to have clean clothes on, it was kept spotless, the air was all run through HEPA filters, high efficiency particulate air filters, so that it was a clean room environment. Everything was very, very sterile, and it was a clean, nice place to work. Temperature was very controlled, and it was interesting. I met some very great people, excellent technicians, and it was a great job I had. It was about 2 years or so. And again, I don't remember exactly the dates, but during the time I was stationed at McGuire, which was around 2 years, a call came out. They needed more instructors back at Lowery Air Force Base in Colorado, because again, the demand for this type of thing was continuing to grow. People were retiring. They wanted new instructors. So I had never taught anything before, but I liked Colorado. And after I had gone to New Jersey, I ended up getting married and having our first child, and my wife at the time had never been out west, so I knew that Denver was an area that she would really enjoy, and I enjoyed it when I was out there for training. So I signed up or volunteered to go back to Lowery Air Force Base as an instructor to teach at the PML school, and it took, I don't know, a few months for everything to go through, but they offered a job back to me, and they transferred and shipped us all out to Colorado and paid for all the moving and all that. And I rented a house off base for the first year or so, and then after that I moved into on-base housing. So I went back to the school, and then they sent you through a training class, several weeks, to teach you how to teach and all the techniques involved with speaking in front of people and speaking in front of classes. And then they started you out with like DC fundamentals. That's the first class, or the first block they called it. I forget how many blocks there were, but you start out with like DC fundamentals, AC fundamentals, power and frequency, and then you just kept building up and more advanced things as you went through. So you start out with just DC circuit theory, and you go through the class again and make your notes, and in the next class you would teach as an assistant to the main instructor until they were confident you could teach the class. And after several times through it, you build up your confidence, and it worked out really well. So I worked my way through several of the classes. At that time there was tube and transistor theory. Now it's coming back. Transistors were a big thing, we're talking, before computer chips, these were just transistors, and you had to talk about how they functioned and how they worked in comparison to tube theory, which you had to teach electron tube theory after you went through AC circuit theory and all that. So with a couple years out there, it was very interesting, and it became very rewarding teaching. I think we had around 30 to 35 students in a class, and we didn't just teach American students. There were students from Greece, students from Iran. At that time we were friends with Iran, and a couple other countries we had students from, and we also had Navy students in there. So it wasn't just Air Force class students, it was several foreign students, and of course Navy students. So you had a mixture of different cultures, and it was pretty interesting. It was a lot of fun. Once I gained confidence and learned how to teach the class and how to relate to the students, it became a lot more fun. And it was very rewarding as you get you taught like a 3 or 4 week block of something, and then they test out and they move on to the next block, and you get a new batch of students in going through the same thing again. So.
Did you have any tips on how to remember all their names when you had new students?
That was very difficult because I'm not a good name person, so it takes me a while to remember people's names. I had them sit in the alphabetical order of where they were, so it helped me to learn who they were. And yeah, learning everyone's name was quite a challenge for me at the time. But like discipline was never a problem. Being in military school, and everybody was already in the military. There was no civilians in this. You didn't have discipline problems or anything like that. I mean, everyone did exactly what they were supposed to do. There was, might have somebody talking. Yes, absolutely. I mean, there was maybe a little talking once in a while, but you had ultimate authority in the class. Even though there were people in the class whose rank was higher than me, those being people who were in other career fields that were the need was less for them for whatever reason, and they realized the need for electronics at the time, so they were cross-training into PMEL. So I was only like an E3, 2-striper. I had 3 stripes, or E4 at the time, and I had guys in my class who were master sergeants and senior master sergeants who were learning the field. They would work it for a while, then they'd end up being in management, but they still had to go through all the classes just like everyone else. So there's never a problem with me being the instructor and them being the student, although they had many more years over me age-wise and were much higher rank. You were still the guy in charge of the class. So that was rewarding, getting respect from people like that.
Now, did you have to write up your own testing materials or lesson plans, or were those
You had to develop, they had a list of basic lesson plans. You had to go through a certain amount of material every day, but you had to draw up your own notes. I had created a lot of notes that went along with the plans that were kind of like canned in order to help you remember certain facts and bring across certain points. Then the testing was all created by the senior staff at the school. So the tests were, I didn't create the tests, I had to just administer the tests that they were given. But you taught everything. If you followed through the lesson plans and did your notes, you would have gone through everything that was ever on the test. So you didn't teach for the test, you taught a wide variety of subjects, but you knew what was on it and what you covered was on the test. And that's what I told the students, is everything that we've gone through is, if there's a test question, we will have covered it in this class, but you have to pay attention. There's no goofing around with this. And some guys did well, some guys didn't. They have to go back, and if they failed, they had to retake that block of training again. So, that's the way it goes. So once in a while you have somebody who comes back, but not too often.
Now, you said you enjoyed Colorado. What particular things did you enjoy about
Well, once
area?
I got used to the area, back when I was in training myself, friends of ours had cars, and we'd drive up to the mountains on the weekends. So you're going up into the Rocky Mountains. I mean, it was great. I mean, I was, from the East Coast, we're used to some mountains, but the Rockies were the next level higher, up above the timberline. We would go on the hikes, and we'd visit the Coors Brewery, twice a month, and had free beer there at the time up in Golden, Colorado. So we traveled around the local area and then went up in the mountains. And that's what I liked, was just the traveling, the scenicness and the beauty of the mountains, and the color of the aspen trees being yellow in the fall was different. I'm used to the full range of colors on the East Coast, but of course out west the aspens turn yellow, and it's very pretty. So I knew that my wife would like that, and we went back after.
And did you ever go to the Air Force Academy to see that?
Just
or
once.
have
We went down there. In fact, when I was married with my wife and our oldest daughter, went down and visited, just traveled through there, went down to Colorado Springs. I'd gone down other times, but we hadn't visited the Air Force Academy until I went back as an instructor, and then we went one weekend, we went down. So there's still a lot to see, although Colorado's become, or Denver area's become much more developed since we left. And the way it is now, it's like a megatropolis that goes from, the northern border all the way down through Colorado Springs. So when I was there in the 70s, it was not as built up as it is today. So I think it was a little better feel back then.
So I gather you moved on somewhere else after you did the training.
What happened was, during the time I was an instructor, at Lowery is when my first 4-year enlistment was up, or approaching being up. That happened, that would have been 1975, which, if everyone remembers, was the first gas crunch, the first oil embargoes, 1975. Well, right about the time I was going to finish my 4-year enlistment, we had the oil embargo, gas prices shot through the roof, unemployment skyrocketed, the system fell apart, and jobs weren't very prevalent. Even though I had electronics training, there was a glitch in this society, in the economy. So I decided, well, I'll take my re-enlistment bonus, which at that time was, I don't know, maybe $3,000 or $4,000, which was a lot of money back then, to re-enlist for a second 4 years. So that's what I did. So I signed up for 4 more years, thinking, well, I'll be able to, maybe stay here in the training center, which I was, comfortable doing for a while. And so starting into my second 4-year enlistment, I thought, well, what the heck, I'll sign up for a few other bases and maybe get the family somewhere else other than just Colorado. We enjoyed it there, but being in the service, you can go just about anywhere on the globe if you signed up for things. So I thought, well, rather than leave the country, I'll sign up to see if I can get to Alaska. So I signed up on an open assignment to Alaska, thinking that, well, they'd probably assign me to the PML at Elmendorf Air Force Base in Anchorage, or up on the northern coast up at Nome. There's 2 Air Force bases at the time, and I thought I'd be assigned to one of those. So I signed on an open assignment to Alaska, thinking, well, they'll send me to one of those 2 bases. And about a month or so later, I received orders to go to Alaska, but it was to Shemya Air Force Base out in the Aleutian Islands, a remote assignment where you can't take your wife or your children. And I guess I didn't do my research because I didn't realize that there was a PML base out in Shemya Air Force Base, Alaska. So unfortunately, I guess, I had to go on this 1-year remote assignment, which I volunteered for, technically. My wife and 2 children at the time, Michael and Mickey and Michael Michael had just been born in July. I had to leave, or in October. I left in July. So July of 1977, July 7th, 1977, I left Denver and my wife and 2 kids behind and flew to Alaska to be acclimated for a month at Elmendorf Air Force Base before being flown out to Shemya Air Force Base, which is way out at the end of the Aleutian Islands, to work in a PML laboratory out there. And that was quite interesting. It was hard being away from your family. And although going in July was interesting because I had never been to Alaska before, I flew into Anchorage on July 7th. And of course, Anchorage is only a few hundred miles south of the Arctic Circle. So we flew in and, 10, 11 o'clock at night rolls around, it's still daylight out. And I thought, this is really cool. I'll never forget that, because the first night I was there, I think the sun kind of set around 1 o'clock in the morning. Of course, it doesn't set, it kind of goes down in an arc. Passed below the horizon around 1 a.m. and came back up above the horizon about 3 a.m. It never got dark. It was just twilight for like 3 hours. So I had a little difficult time sleeping because it was still kind of daylight out. And I thought that was the neatest thing of experiencing like 21 hours of daylight. And of course that continued through the summer. And that was very interesting to me. I'd never experienced that before. I'll never forget it. Conversely, after 6 months of being on the island, I came back through Alaska to come back for a month's leave. And of course the sun pops up at 10 and sets at 2. And it's very low on the horizon, so it never gets very warm, and you don't see a whole lot of daylight, 4 hours of daylight maybe in the middle of winter. So that's the opposite. That was interesting too. But at any rate, when we flew into Anchorage, we had to go through a lot of Arctic weather training and stuff for the cold weather. We received cold weather gear and learned about survival and such like that in the cold, although it never really got that cold out at Shemya because the North Pacific currents are fairly warm. Other guys were going to other places in Alaska, Nome and farther north, so they needed this cold weather training much more than I did, but you all had to go through the same orientation. It took a couple of weeks with different duties and such. And at any rate, then I flew out to Shemya Air Force Base, which was a refueling base, and mainly, I guess this isn't all top secret anymore. At the time, Shemya Air Force Base had a very powerful radar system that was used to look out over Russia for missile launches. That radar system was called the Cobra Dane radar system, which used phased array radar. At the time was very new, cutting edge technology back in '77. It was built probably in 76 or 75 approximately. And what they did there is they had this huge radar building which used these small, about 4-inch ceramic discs, and each disc was an individual transmitter and receiver. It was controlled by a computer system which took up an entire floor of this building at that time. And each disc being a transmitter and receiver, they could phase, they called a phased array radar system, they could phase the angle at which these discs were sending their energy out and being reflected back, so they could look and see different places in the sky at the same time, thousands of miles away. And what this was used for is if the Russians launched a missile, back in those days they were MIRVs, multiple reentry vehicles, the missile launched up, they could detect it, and as soon as the missile separated from the multiple launch, within a few moments they could project the trajectory and know where the missiles were going to go. And that's what that building was there for. It was the last link in the DEW line. And then other radar bases continued across Alaska and across Canada, of course. We were the farthest one out that looked over Russia, so we would be the first ones to detect a launch. So that's why we were there, and that's why they needed a PMEL system there in order to calibrate the equipment used to maintain the radar system. And then they also had a flight base there where they refueled the Hurricane hunting aircraft from the Coast Guard. So when the submarine chasers were out flying around the North Pacific, hunting Russian submarines, they needed to fuel up. They'd stop at Shemya, and they would fuel up at Shemya, then continue back out across the Pacific and pick up wherever they left off Russian sub, XYZ. So there was a lot of refueling going on up there as well. And at the time, the other thing they had up there, of course, you needed a secret clearance just to be there. And again, now these aircraft is retired, but the SR-71 Blackbirds, if you've heard about those, the really fast black reconnaissance aircraft that the Air Force had back in the 70s, they kept a couple of those there. You never saw them. They never took off in the daytime, only at night. And they're kept in a special hangar. It was all top secret. I'm sure certain people knew about it, but and guys worked on those, and no one talked about it. But at night, when they took off, you could hear these things because the sound of their engine was so different than a normal jet engine, and you could hear them take off, and hours later you hear them come back, and then they'd land and park them in the hangars and close the doors, and everybody pretended that they weren't there. But now those aircraft, I understand, have been retired. They don't use them anymore, but they flew out of Shemya Air Force Base and did reconnaissance, I guess, looking around over Russia and stuff at the same time. So that's what went on out there, a place that nobody even knows about.
And did you have leave and no place to go out there, or? No,
you stayed there for 6 months, and then you came back to wherever you wanted to go to for a month, 30 days, and then went back for 6 more months. So the hard part was coming back for leave, on leave, and seeing your wife and family, and then having to go back for 6 more months of that. Although it wasn't horrible, it wasn't like it wasn't dangerous. I mean, the Vietnam War was going on, or winding down, but there was no danger really out there. There was no battles or anything, so it was relatively safe. The only thing that did happen is all those islands are right along the Pacific Ring of Fire, and there was earthquakes occasionally. You'd feel, the room shake or the building shake. Nothing too severe, but if you look up your history, you'll see that Shemya was occupied by the Japanese during World War II. So the old runways and old hangars that were there were built by the Japanese, and one of them, I still have slide pictures of it, had the rising sun on the front of the hangar door. And these hangars were all, very weathered and in very bad shape. The runways that the Japanese built, because of the earthquakes and tremors, had heaved, so a lot of times, we had extra time to walk around the island. The runway would go across, and the whole runway would drop 6 feet down to the ground, just drop right off. It would go out of ways, then it would come back up 6 or 8 feet and continue, and then the end of it had been lost in the sea. So the runway went right out and just dropped off to where it fell into the ocean from when they had built it. So that was interesting. And the old hangars were along that runway that the Japanese had built. And then our runway was over on the other side of the island along a straight edge, and it was right, of course, ocean to ocean on each end, with new hangars and stuff built there, and the old runway was up on the other side, was abandoned. But you could go walk around. The island was about 2 miles by 4 miles. It wasn't very big, and when you weren't working, you had to run the whole place. You could go walk around. I took a lot of pictures, mostly slides at the time. Some of them I developed because I had a photo lab. You could develop your own slides. And black sand beaches on the one side. I think it was the Pacific side. The beaches were just beautiful black sand beaches, nobody on them. Of course, it's too cold, but beautiful black sand, volcanic sand. The northern side of the island was all rock, which is the Bering Sea, very turbulent. And so the one side of the island was turbulent, the other side was relatively calm. The weather was pretty messy most of the time, a lot of rain and fog. It never got really below like 25 degrees, so the real cold weather gear we had really didn't need. Reason for that is the North Pacific currents flow clockwise up from Japan. So North Pacific water, ocean water, is relatively warm on our southern side. The Bering Sea water is like 40 degrees colder on the other side of the islands. So this temperature variation in water that's mixing all on the Aleutian Islands created a weather pattern which was always foggy and rainy and misty. So it never got very cold in the middle of winter, but it was always breezy and damp and cold, I guess like being in England, something like that. And it was foggy. When I went there in July, well, let's say July 7th, I didn't go there till sometime in August, early August. It was about 3 or 4 weeks. I was in the mainland and flew out. It was completely fogged in. It was always foggy. And of course, you drove around, you followed roads. But honestly, Ken, you couldn't see more than 20 feet in front of you for months. I'd never seen that. All I knew is where you come to a stop sign, you make a right, you follow the road to the left, you went a little ways and you saw a gate, you pulled in, there was the building I worked at. You never saw the whole picture, you only saw fog. And it wasn't until August, September, sometime in late October, I woke up one day and the sun was shining. I couldn't believe it. I looked out my dorm window. We had 2 guys to a room, there's a large dorm there as well, similar to the ones in Colorado. And you could see the whole island. I could look out, I could see other buildings, I could see radar domes, I could see the building I worked at. It was crystal clear out. The weather cleared, and in October is when, I guess, October, November is when the weather cleared out there. I just couldn't believe it. I could see everything. You know, the entire island, you could run outside and look around the entire island and see it all. Where until that time, there was, every day was nothing but fog and mist. And then all of a sudden it cleared, and it stayed clear for several days, or maybe several weeks. And it was so invigorating to be able to see the island and see where you were, and oh, there's the building I work at, and you know, there's a chow over there, you know, there's a theater, you know, before you could never see them because they're all buried in fog.
Now, were there civilians living on the island? Or?
There were no, everyone on the island was associated with the military. There were civilian contractors that worked for General Electric that actually maintained the radar systems. The Air Force, you know, owned the radar system, but GE was the manufacturer and the maintenance people. It's the very specialized engineers who took care of this equipment. So we calibrate all our electronic equipment, which they use, but GE technicians are the ones who actually maintain their radar systems, both this one and the older one that they were phasing out at the time, these large fan antennas. So there was a fair number, I don't remember exactly how many, maybe 30 or 40 or 50 GE contract employees working for the Air Force on Shemya Air Force Base. The rest of the staff was all military people, the doctor too. There were a few women Air Force people there, very few, maybe 10 or 12. The rest was all guys, but no civilians. The only animal on the island was a Shemya wolf, or excuse me, Shemya fox. There's a Shemya. And if you look it up in your animal magazines or books, you'll see the Shemya fox as a specific fox on Shemya. And that's it, no other animals besides the Shemya fox. I've seen a couple of them when I was out there. Seagulls and stuff like that, but no other animals. You could walk around the island and look at all the old gun emplacements that the Japanese built. In the hills, the island had a highest area, 300 feet above sea level approximately. That's where the radar system sat, looking west. But all around that, on the perimeter of most of the island, were old gun emplacements, old what crushed in Quonset huts, all built into the ground, and trenches along the, it was like a steep cliff that dropped down to the ocean. A few feet back was a trench, which of course had fallen in, but that's where the guys would look out across the sea for invaders and stuff back during the war, when the Japanese held this island during World War II. I'm going back to the hangars. You could walk around and look at everything. The hangars were all falling apart, but still in relatively good condition considering they were built in the 40s. And a lot of the lumber in it was teak. It was beautiful wood. And of course, they just left everything when they went. So there was, catwalks and tool cribs with parts in it that were still left there, and, a lot of very beautiful looking woodwork building a wooden hangar back in the 40s with teak wood was, quite an accomplishment. And they were there just weathering in the wind. So I've got a lot of photographs of that just all falling apart. But very large buildings. Doors.
Quite surprising to know that there were no Eskimo settlements around.
No, none. There was a little harbor on the one side of the island. And going back to the weather thing, when the weather cleared in October, November, December, a narrow window, during that clear weather time is when they had scheduled to bring in all of our food and supplies for an entire year, and that was interesting. Since it was a refueling base, they needed a couple of tankers of jet fuel and also diesel fuel to run the generators that generated power to power both the island's electricity and the energy for this radar system. So as soon as the weather cleared, the barges started to come in, and they were all timed. The logistics of this was interesting to me. The fuel barge would pull in, he'd offload, a full barge load of jet fuel into tankers on the tank farm up the hill. They'd pump it off. And that tanker was no more than empty, disconnected, and pushed back out to sea by a tug. And the next tanker was coming on the horizon to pull in and be pulled in and offload. So they would unload jet fuel and diesel fuel first, several tankers full, and then they'd bring in the cargo, the barges with all our food and supplies, which they offload into underground freezer warehouses that were, and you couldn't see them, they were all underground. And the first thing they'd offload off of the barge was flatbed trucks, because we didn't have the equipment to haul all the equipment. So they'd offload flatbed trucks, they'd offload forklifts, and they'd offload tractors, and then they'd offload the cargo onto the flatbeds, and then the forklifts would go up, and then they'd use the forklifts to unload the flatbeds and put them in the cold storage. So this whole thing was orchestrated. And after that barge was empty, the next barge pulled up, and they'd unload, 50 pallets of frozen hamburger patties and butter and everything you needed to supply a island of 1,500 people for a year. So, and by the time the last barge was done and the offloading was finished, because everyone kind of helped out with that process, it was kind of interesting. Within a week the fog rolled back in, the weather got bad, the sea got rough, and that was it. You were stuck there, until the weather cleared enough that you could fly in or out of the island.
Because I think most of us think of the Aleutian Islands as being bleak.
Yeah, it was
No, I
pretty
guess
bleak
they
out.
are.
Yeah, it was. So then the supplies would last for a year, and the jet fuel would last, and the diesel fuel would last, and next year at the same time they'd bring in all the barges and load us all back up again. There were flights in and out when they could, but sometimes the weather was bad enough they couldn't fly out of there very easily. In fact, when we flew in, coming back from leave, it was a very difficult flight, and we were, coming down the runway, and you could look out the window and see the runway, because we're coming in at about a 30-degree angle to the wind, and just before touchdown, the aircraft would straighten out and land, so that's kind of nerving. And you're looking, there's the runway there, and that's where, we're flying in this direction with the airplanes facing this way. That's how windy it would get. And of course, the end runway, at the end of the runway was the ocean, so there wasn't a whole lot of overlap. There was a lot of room for mistake. So anyway, the logistics of how the whole thing worked was very interesting to me. Another interesting thing on Shemya was, in order to power this new radar system, the Cobra Dane radar system at the time, they needed 2 huge generators, which were just monstrous, and I had never seen anything like it. They were, generators where, you walked on catwalks up where the cylinders were, and the crankshaft was below the floor, and they generators took power off the sides of the engine, which just ran at a very slow speed, but had tremendous mass, and it was all diesel powered. What they did is the heat that these 2 large generators created in their heating and their cooling jackets, that water was pumped underground to heat the buildings on the island. So in the summer, winter, spring, fall, you always had heat come out of your register, because that was the cooling water for the generators, which they, and so in the summer when it got a little warmer out, you just had to open windows because you couldn't turn off the heat. The heat was required to come out, but that's how they heated the island, was from the generator.
Do they have a natural water supply there?
Yes, there was like an underground aquifer of some sort. We had fresh water. I guess it rained enough, was misty enough that they didn't have to, there was no desalination plant that I know of. They pumped water from underground. Although the water had a, almost like a fuel smell to it, probably from years of pollution and stuff. So you could wash, your clothes always look kind of gray. The water looked kind of gray. So you didn't drink a lot of the water. It didn't smell really, but you took showers with it, and you were fine, and it did your laundry, but there was like almost like a diesel fuel smell to the water, but it was fresh water from the island. In fact, there was a lake or two on the high part of the island that stayed full the whole time I was there. I guess there's enough rain to supply the ground with enough water that fed us all. That's a good question.
What kind of recreational opportunities did you have on the base? And what about medical facilities also?
There was a doctor, or maybe 2 doctors assigned. There was a small clinic. If you were injured or whatever, maybe a nurse was there, I don't remember. I think it was 2 doctors. And they were assigned to take care of anything that happened to anyone. If you were very serious and they could fly you out, of course they flew you back to the mainland. But they had a little hospital, they had a dentist, like I said, a couple doctors. Recreation, they had a gymnasium and they had a theater. A regular, 300 people theater with projectors and everything. We got movies through the armed forces, movie network or whatever it was, weekly, usually when the supply planes came in. And in fact, it brings up a good point, Ken, is as a part-time job, I worked for the armed forces, like recreational services, in the theater, showing movies and selling popcorn in evenings on the weekends. It was like a little part-time job, which I used to buy some stuff through the armed forces, catalog. I bought speakers and stereo equipment and sent it back to my wife. So that was kind of like a part-time job I had, and I learned how to run the projectors, and they were the old type with a carbon arc. You get your arc burn, and then you jet your adjustments, and a little motorized assembly kept the arc as it burned away, together to create the light for the projector, and you learn to watch for the timing marks, which I still do today when I watch a movie. I still see them, to know when to start up the second projector. The second mark comes on, you flip the switch, and the shutter on the one closes, and on the other one opens, and the other trailer takes right off where the other one stops. So, and you rewind this, this tape, and we received our boxes of movies, and they were like 5 or 6 reels in a box, and we played them, for guys. They pay $1, I think it was, and other friends of mine worked in the concession stand, and it was that's one of the things we did, was watch movies. And of course,
what about television and radio coverage? How did you get to find out what was going on back in the States?
There was a TV station on the base, so there was one TV channel that you could watch. It was all, run by the military.
Armed Forces Radio?
Armed Forces Radio you had, and one TV channel, which was just a local. You really didn't know a whole lot was going on in the rest of the world at the time, I don't think. Ken, they may have given you some generalized news of things. There was really no newspapers. If you got one, it was a week late. I don't remember a whole lot about current events. I don't think we had a whole lot of them.
How about mail? Did you get mail?
Yes, we did receive mail. There were flights that came in maybe once or twice a week when they could. They would bring mail, medical supplies. They would fly people out who were sick. They would, people whose time was up, they would fly them back out. So it was both, cargo and people hauling whenever the weather was good enough that they could land and not windy enough. And there was several weeks that would go by when there was no flights because it was just way too breezy, windy out. So we did get some fresh vegetables now and then, and we did get mail. It took about, I would say, a week for a letter to get from my wife in Denver to me and back and forth. You could send mail, and then once a week on a certain day, there was phone booths set up, and you could spend 10 minutes in the phone booth calling whoever you wanted. I guess in case I called my wife. One night a week for like 10 minutes on a certain night, depending upon the first letter of your last name. It was all worked out. So you had these phone booths. You just picked up the phone. You said, I want to talk to this number in Denver, Colorado, and some switchboard operator in Atlanta or in Alaska would plug you in. Your house number would dial, and it was a free phone call. The government paid for it. That was the real communication that you had with your family, and mail. No internet, no cell phones. This was way before any of that kind of stuff.
Did they do anything special for holidays like Thanksgiving, Easter, Christmas?
Yeah, the chow hall would have special dinners, like, for Thanksgiving we'd have turkey, and the food was great. I mean, people complain about military food. Maybe it was just the Air Force thing, or because we had civilian contractors, but the one thing we could really do there was eat. Since everybody on the island was in the military, so there was no ID cards. You just walked in the chow hall anytime, day or night. There was midnight chow, mornings, lunches, dinners, and then, since there were shifts going on 24 hours a day, things were working, you could walk down to the chow hall at 2 in the morning, order a everything omelet, and somebody would make an omelet for you, would throw everything in there.
It's like a cruise ship
yeah,
today.
You had your coffee always ready, big decanters of coffee, and one thing you could do there, Ken, was just eat yourself silly, and I did.
Sounds like there wasn't much else to do.
Watch movies and eat.
Watch your work.
So the food was great. I really, I had no complaints with the food. We had steak. Remember, once a week we had steak, and the next day after steak you'd have meatloaf, because the steaks they didn't eat, they ground up in meatloaf. So, you know, I love the meatloaf. It was all ground up steak, and it was frozen, of course, beforehand. But the food was very good. I mean, we ate very well. You could eat any time, day or night that you wanted to. We worked normal. The job I had was pretty much normal days, 8 to 5. We didn't work, I mean, we had a very relatively easy workload. We had plenty of people doing the job I had to do, so we had basically a lot of time off, but not really much to do. You'd go to the theater. I got into photography. That's where I took pictures all around, developed film, got into a little bit of ham radio. A friend of mine, there was a ham radio shack on the island that we used. My calls line was KL7JFE at the time. KL7 was Alaska, and JFE was my call, so I was KL7JFE. I only did Morse code. I wasn't very good at it. Good enough to get my license, and that was about it. And after I left Alaska, I never used it again. So, but I did study it enough to get a ham license to use the radios a little bit.
Now, because of the type of work you were involved in, was the base on a high alert because of its closeness, proximity to Russia?
Pretty much, yes. They'd have we'd have drills once in a while where we had to, you know, go to your work site. In case there was maybe a missile attack or something like that. And of course, again, this was, you know, 1978, 77, 78. We had drills like that, but in order to be assigned to the base, you had to have a secret clearance, so no one was there without a secret clearance. But we didn't, you know, I mean, we didn't have weapons or anything like that. I guess they had enough early warning. If someone came at us, they'd know it. So, you know, we were on a level of alert, but it was pretty much all the time. And we only had a drill once in a while in order to go to your work site in case something happened. So it wasn't too bad.
So then when you ended your tour in Alaska, where did you go after that?
After that, then, after my year, I went back to Lowery Air Force Base in Colorado. And instead of teaching in the basic training classes, which I had done earlier, they had an opening in a liquid oxygen pressurization class. I don't remember the exact name of it, but what it was for is for testing equipment that's used in high pressure oxygen environments, usually by naval submariners. So the class taught mostly Navy sub guys how to clean and check pressure equipment used in oxygen rich environments. And the gauges and stuff that you'd use had to be rinsed out with trichloroethane, which is like a fluorine-based substance, a chemical. And what you did is you rinsed the products out with this once you got them working on them or maintaining, because you can't have any hydrocarbons or oil in an oxygen environment. It's a fuel and it would explode. So the gauges were rinsed with this Freon material, and then a sample was taken of it in a little beaker, a little tiny cylinder. I forget the name of these equipment. And then it was put into an infrared spectrophotometer, and through the electron beam was passed that looked for hydrocarbons. And the machine would read out in parts per million the hydrocarbon level of the Freon, and at a certain point you knew the gauges were clean enough to go back into an oxygen-rich environment. And then they were sealed and calibrated and stamped, and then those gauges would put on a shelf, and then would be used like on a submarine or ship, wherever they had, an oxygen area. So that class was very specialized, and I went through training for it, and then taught that for about a year and a half to mostly naval personnel. And it was called LOX class, liquid oxygen. And you know, it's a very important thing not to have any dirt in an oxygen-rich environment. So that's what that was. That was one of these special classes I was telling you about. I got into teaching one of those, and I did that until I got out of the Air Force in '79.
Now, while you were up in Alaska, and going back a bit, you were separated from the family. Did they stay in Colorado at the military facility?
Correct. Since I was on a remote assignment, we were, at the time before I left, we were living on base housing on Lowery Air Force Base, which was a great place to be. It was new base housing at the time. So my wife and my 2 children could stay living on the base during the time I was at my remote assignment. And that worked out very well. My wife then got a part-time job working on the base, doing something at one of the training centers. And
did they have their own school or did the children have to catch a bus and go to the regular schools outside of the base perimeter?
that's a good point, Ken. I actually don't remember.
They may have been too young for school.
Yeah, my son was only 6 months old when I left, and my daughter's 3 years old. So they were preschool
Too
age.
young.
They may have went to a preschool, or like maybe a preschool daycare thing when my wife worked, but they were young. They weren't even in kindergarten yet. So that's a good question. I think the base, I think, had like a little preschool daycare thing for employees, but if we would have stayed there long enough that the kids would have had to go to regular school, it would have been off base. It would have been at Priory in Aurora, Colorado, at a public school.
Mhm.
But the kids were feeling, so when I got back, Chris was a year and a half, so Mickey was about 5, so she would have been just about entering kindergarten.
Mhm.
Looking back again to Alaska, in that remote area, did you have to do your own laundry, pressing, and all of that, or did you have contractors handling that?
No, we did that. You took care. We had little wash machine rooms, a laundry room, just like you'd have in a hotel or something like that. And we took care of our own laundry. Did all your clothes, did all your ironing, you did all that yourself. They had, and even the chow hall was manned by Air Force people. There was no contractors running the chow hall. It was all Air Force chow hall people, guys in the service just like we were. This is before the day he started using contractors for all that stuff, which I think was a mistake. But
Were there periods when you had to undergo weapons training?
only during basic training is when we had M16 qualify, and I got my little ribbon for target shooting and all that great stuff. I like that. After basic training, I never had a weapon in my hand again in the service. The guys the security, Air Force security people who worked on the flight line, they carried M16s with them during the time I was in Alaska. So they'd have weapons when they would come into the chow hall, and they carried sidearms. But they were like our Air Force security people, and they would, escort different people, and they were in charge of the flight line protection. As far as like guns, like there were small arms, but to my recollection, the island wasn't, there was no artillery or nothing to defend the island with outside of small arms that the security people had at that time that I can remember. There were no gun emplacements or anything like that. If anybody would attack us, I guess they'd get us. But
You mentioned you had doctors there. What about the dental care for you there?
yeah, there was a dental. There was
A PX or
well, there was a
a
dental.
BX?
DX.
Yeah, there was a base exchange or post exchange. I forget which ours was. We had a little store where you could buy your soap and your laundry detergent, and, stuff like that. Underwear, clothing. It was little. It probably wasn't much bigger than this room. You could buy, they had beer there. You could buy beer. No hard alcohol, but you could buy beer, sodas, cigarettes. Of course, I didn't smoke, but so we had like a little. You could buy the things you needed, like a little store.
Sounds like it'd be kind of boring after a while
It was,
without.
it was real boring, especially since you didn't work in our particular job. You didn't have to work more than 40 hours a week, in the lab. So we hung around with a bunch of guys. We'd have little barbecues. Like our group that we worked with would have a little barbecue set up somewhere, and we'd all go to the movies together. There was a little bowling alley. Where the heck was that? One of their buildings had a small, like 3 or 4 lane bowling alley. There was a little gym somewhere you could goof around in, or watch our one TV channel.
So when you went back to Colorado and then you were discharged there, or?
Yes, what happened was friends of mine who I worked with in PMEL and who I worked with at the training center separated from the Air Force before me, and several of them went to work for McDonnell Douglas Corporation on Lowery Air Force Base, which was a contractor that maintained the equipment used in the training center. The training center that the Air Force used had the tests were taken on a sheet of paper and they were put into a reader, which then read the test and entered that information into a computer. And some of the training was computer-based. Like it went from all instructor-based training to, as things progressed, to some computer-based training where students were into a room. There was 10 or 15 computers, flat-screen computers at the time, and the programs would run and they'd have to interact and they learned things. This was like early computer-based training. All this was tied in with a testing system. The equipment that was used by the Air Force for this training was maintained by McDonnell Douglas Corporation. They designed, built, and maintained it. On our Air Force Base, they had a repair center and technical center where they had an old barracks building they refurbished, and the engineers worked there that maintained and kept this whole training system going. Friends of mine went to work for them when they got out of the service as employees, electronics, repairing this equipment. That's what I did. I knew the people, I interviewed. So the day I got out of the Air Force and separated, I went, got my final orders, and I went to the next office and got my civilian ID badge and drove off the base. The next day I drove in the base as a civilian and went to McDonnell Douglas facility and started working, repairing the equipment that I used at the Female Training Center, which I was already familiar with as far as using it and stuff goes. And worked for McDonnell Douglas for about 3 years out in Colorado before I left them and came to work for Hewlett Packard in Albany back in, what year was that I started? 1982 I think it was when I started with Hewlett Packard in Albany.
So then you came back east after
Yes.
enjoying the West.
Yes, I was, as a civilian then we lived off base. It was a period of time, I skipped over it, when I came back and worked in the oxygen training class. We bought a house off base and moved to Aurora and lived maybe 5 or 6 miles east of the Air Force Base. So then when I got out of the service, we had a house to live in and all that. So then after a few years with McDonnell Douglas, the problem with that job was that it was year-to-year contract. So every year you never knew whether the contract was going to be renewed for the next year. So after a couple years of that, it didn't feel too comfortable. Other friends of mine, again, this whole thing is set up through friendships, went to work for Hewlett Packard back east. And they called me up one day and said, hey, Hewlett Packard's hiring lots of technicians for computers they're building and putting in customers all around the East Coast. They need field techs. How would you like to come back east and go to work? I said, yeah, come on, do it. So it was a little tough getting the wife to go back east, but I thought we were in Colorado long enough and moved back east in, 82 there, and started with Hewlett Packard.
So yours was a good experience where the knowledge you gained in your active service then carried you through
Absolutely.
civilian life.
It dictated the direction of my life completely with electronics and computers and maintenance. So no hard feelings. It was, I wouldn't want to do it over again, but I have no regrets whatsoever of my time in the service.
Good. Okay, well, thank you very much for serving our country
Thank
and
you,
for
Jim.
doing this interview.
You're very welcome.